Good day or good evening, however we find you. Welcome to our 9th episode of Creation, Genesis, and Origins. With me is my co-host Ken Miller, and in previous episodes we saw Adam as a historical figure known as Atum in Egypt, Adapa to the Akkadians and Sumerians, Adamu to the Assyrians, and Adam to the rest of us. Here's a quick chart showing all the individuals that were said to be created in Near Eastern legends and in Genesis. Do you notice a similarity between Atum, Adapa, and Adam? Is there a commonality between Ta, Ea, and Yahweh? Does Seth sound anything like Seth? Would it be unreasonable to posit that all these texts are related?
What we have been trying to emphasize is that in addition to the narrative in Genesis and Adam's name mentioned in the New Testament, evidence for Adam and his generations comes from other sources and from various authors.
Phoenicia was an ancient civilization located in the north of Canaan, centered along the coastal regions of modern-day Lebanon. Sanchoniathon of Beirut lived approximately between 1300 and 900 BC. He is the reputed author of 3 lost works written originally in the Phoenician language and surviving in what was incorporated into a Greek translation by Philo of Byblus, according to Eusebius of Caesarea. The Phoenician language belongs to the group of Canaanite languages. Partially on that basis and their location, plus the knowledge they would have had of early Semitic history, it is generally agreed that the Phoenician civilization was of Canaanite ancestry. Porphyry was a Neoplatonist philosopher born in Tyre in Phoenicia. He incorporated Sanchoniathon in his own works. According to Porphyry, Sanchoniathon wrote the truest history of the Semitic peoples. In his literature, Sanchoniathon incorporated Genesis 6:4 by mentioning the Nephilim, the Titans. Adam, in a not altogether flattering account, is the subject of his section titled Generations.
These are his words. Adam, landsman, they called Uranus, Shama. Uranus was the first ruler of the universe according to Greek mythology, and his emblem was the serpent. From the excellence of his beauty, he names the upper world.
One has to wonder about Porphyry's definition of truest, as the narrative about Adam is fanciful beyond belief. However, the importance lies not in the accuracy of the legend, but that the subject, Adam, had to be well known to gain any acceptance among the Phoenician readers. Just as Gilgamesh was the subject of fantastic legends in ancient Sumer, and his name is recorded as the 5th king of Erech in the post-flood era, so too does an imaginary tale of Adam play on his popularity among the recipients and virtually substantiate his existence for us.
Supermarket tabloids of today reminds us that human nature hasn't changed much over the centuries. People love to read stories about famous personalities. And the point here is not that the stories in extra-biblical literature were true or untrue, but that the subjects had to be true life, historical persons, or the stories wouldn't have been copied or repeated. In essence, they wouldn't have been written down at all.
Looking at the subject of a historical Adam, we have to face a reality. Either Adam was a real-life, flesh and blood, God-fearing human being, or he wasn't. There is no intermediate position. We either have Adam wearing his fig leaf, or we have Adam who was only a figment. The issue can be couched in theological terms, but there is no escaping a fundamental fact of life, or non-life. Adam either existed in the flesh, or he didn't. When we began to discover enough about the world to see that it was impossible to specifically identify the first human being, who must have lived hundreds of thousands of years ago, even millions of years ago, depending on whatever definition we apply, a historical Adam has been rejected by many, and the presumption has been embraced that there was no Adam at all. The theory is that Adam fits a theological role to tell us that all mankind has been born with a sinful nature, and that as a symbolic figure, the story of Adam and Eve helps us understand something that otherwise we would not.
The rationale for eliminating Adam from the roles of those who once breathed air is simple. The Neolithic surroundings of Adam's immediate family prohibit him from having lived far enough back in time that he could have been the forerunner of those who lived in times more ancient. Even the Old Stone Age predates Adam's appearance in Mesopotamia. Adam's sons raised grain and livestock. Stone Age men foraged for food where they could find it and chased animal herds, for example.
The assumption among these Bible scholars is that the author of Genesis either thought Adam was the first human being, which would be impossible, or that the author enclosed a theological message in a fable of his own making. Seeing a logical impasse, it made sense to some to simply remove poor Adam from life's scene and consider him as a theological construct, gone but not forgotten. For the sake of discussion, let's assume Adam did not exist, let alone the Old Testament narrative in Genesis and Chronicles, and notwithstanding Genesis reports he had sons and daughters. Let's look at the New Testament and see what the effects would be of Adam missing in action.
Luke dutifully recorded the genealogy of Christ, ending with Adam. At the beginning of the chain of ancestry, Luke 3:38 records, with our own inserts added, which was the son of Enosh, which was the son of Seth, which was the son of non-existent Adam, which was the non-existent Son of God.
Please don't make any pen and ink changes to your Bible. Did Seth have no father? Maybe Seth was non-existent too. How about the next on the list of patriarchs, Enosh? We could ask that question with everyone in the chain named in Genesis, Chronicles, and Luke, all the way to Christ himself 4,000 years later. At what point could the real persons be phased in with those who had no life but only fill some hypothetical theological niche? The reality is that flesh and blood human beings do have flesh and blood human fathers, with the exception of Christ himself, who was conceived of the Holy Spirit. But Noah, Abraham, David, and all the rest who are named in the biblical texts had fathers who are also named.
Romans 5:14. Nevertheless, death reigned from non-existent Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned, after the similitude of non-existent Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come.
How can death come to a non-existent life? Plus, how did he sin if he was never born? How can an Adam who never was be the figure of him who died for us? By implication, this calls into question the legitimacy of the death and resurrection of Christ himself.
1 Corinthians 15:22. For as in non-existent Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive.
Men who don't live don't die. So just as a non-existent Adam could not die, therefore we won't die and don't require being saved? What a curious theological premise that would be.
1 Corinthians 15:45. And so it is written, the first man, non-existent, Adam, was made a living soul. The last Adam was made a quickening spirit.
How could Adam, if he had no life to begin with, become a living soul? Would we conclude that since the first man was not, therefore he was not made a living soul, and the last Adam, therefore, was not made a quickening spirit? What kind of theology would that be?
1 Timothy 2:13. For non-existent Adam was first formed, then Eve.
Would that make any sense at all? A non-existent Adam begs a non-existent Eve. Who needs a wife if you aren't alive to appreciate it?
1 Timothy 2:14. And non-existent Adam was not deceived, but the non-existent woman being deceived was in the transgression.
Of course, Adam was not deceived if there was no Adam to deceive. And if a non-existent rib was taken to fashion a wife, then she must have been non-existent too. No man, no woman, no deception, no transgression, no sin. It seems the one who would have been deceived were Luke and Paul. Apparently, they believed there was such a person as Adam.
Even Josephus, the historian who lived during the time of Christ, incorporated in his history some information about Adam that even the writer of Genesis did not include. The point is this: taking Adam off the list of historical biblical personalities solves nothing at all. One cannot climb into an ivory tower, take a theological position, and escape all the consequences. The idea of a fictitious Adam is fraught with unsavory theological implications.
After Adam leaves the garden, the writer of Genesis focuses in on his first son, who carries out an egregious act of violence and kills his younger brother, bringing about his banishment from the confines of Eridu, where he must make his way removed from family and friends. Cain's concern for his safety causes God to give him some kind of mark, Genesis 4:15, to afford him safe passage and acceptance wherever it is he goes to dwell.
We can assume Cain did not just wander off and disappear, or else the Genesis writer would have no idea what he named the city, or who his offspring were that are described in Genesis 4:16 through 25, or what they did. Cain's whereabouts and the accomplishments and attitudes of his descendants were well enough known that they could be recorded.
There did exist at one time some historical information upon which Josephus could draw in compiling his history of the Jews. He records that Cain became wickeder and it obliged him to be injurious to his neighbors, quote unquote.
According to Josephus, he augmented his household substance with much wealth. By rapine and violence, he incited his acquaintance to luxury and robbery, and became their leader in wicked courses.
He introduced weights and measures according to Josephus, and whereas they lived innocently and generously while they knew nothing of such arts, he changed the world into cunning craftiness. He first of all set boundaries about land. He built a city and fortified it with walls, and compelled his family to crowd into it and called it Enoch after the name of his son, Enoch.
We already knew Genesis 4:16 through 18 that Cain's son was Enoch, and the city was named for him. But here the historian provides us with some valuable information that helps us to know where it was that Cain now called home, and some of the circumstances.
The people living in the city where Cain settled were less culturally advanced. He taught them things that quite likely he learned at Eridu. Also, they needed a fortified city with walls to help them defend themselves from attackers.
The Sumerian king list discussed in previous episodes helps us here. After two Akkadian kings reigned at Eridu, Alulim, and Alagar, Eridu was smitten with weapons. Kingship to Badabira is carried.
When a city is destroyed and its king removed and a new king reigns in the victorious city, that is a good reason to build a fortified city. And apparently Cain did exactly that. Those who had been living in Eridu at that time would have been the indigenous population, Ubadans quite likely, and the descendants of Seth. Now, as the dreary results of war, they needed to leave, and the pottery remains found at Eridu suggest they did. But where would Seth's family go for a safe haven?
Genesis gives us reason to believe Seth's family lived in close proximity to Cain's family, perhaps for protection, in or near to a fortified city.
This slide compares the names of the sons of Cain alongside the sons of Seth. And what we are looking for are signs that these two families lived in close proximity, evidenced by their naming their children similar names, something that would be unlikely if there was great distance and no communication between the two families. At the outset, the son of Cain has a counterpart in the family of Seth. The difference between Irad and Jerad could be simply a translational difference, converting Hebrew into English. Sumerologist and Hebrew scholar William Hallow considers that the Hebrew name Irad is linked with the Akkadian city Eridu, which does make logical sense. Methusael is not far off Methuselah, and Lamech on the Cain side rings with Lamech on the Seth side.
This similarity in names gives us ample reason to believe two families remain in close proximity.
So a good reason to believe these two families remained in close contact comes from comparing the two genealogies in Genesis. If Cain had pulled a disappearing act, there is no way subsequent Semite generations who follow Noah would have had any knowledge as to who Cain's descendants were, or anything about them. Also, the narrative of Cain's generations give us valuable historical perspective.
In Genesis 4:19 through 20, we read, "And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The names of the one was Adah, and the name of the other Zillah. And Adah bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle."
The text is not telling us that everyone living in a tent or raising livestock descended directly from Jabal, just that there were those who did in his family or his extended family, such as a tribe. And we know that raising domesticated cattle was an activity relegated to a time period after 12,000 years ago.
This is Genesis 4:21. "And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ."
This is an example of what a harp looked like in the days of ancient Sumer. We can suppose that harps in the days of Jubal may have been more rustic. Again, we have no cause to believe that all those who played musical instrument were Jubal's offspring. Jubal likely was at the head of a tribe that had musicians in it, and although bone flutes may have been found dated to earlier than 30,000 years associated with Cro-Magnon man, certainly no stringed musical instruments date to such an early period.
Here is Genesis 4:22. "And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah."
Implements and crude weapons of bronze have been recovered dating to as early as 3000 BC. Firing temperatures hot enough to smelt iron was not obtained until about 1000 BC. However, bog iron was available and could be beaten into useful tools.
The last descendant of Cain was named in Genesis, and maybe the last of Cain's line, whoever lived, spoke to his wives in Genesis 4:23 through 24. Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. Hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold.
Rampant sin without remorse is on display here. Tubal-Cain, according to Josephus, devised armor for the girding of the body. He goes on to say, even while Adam was alive, the posterity of Cain became exceeding wicked, one after another by force of example, turning out worse.
Returning to the Sumerian king list, once more it proves useful identifying Cain's city named Enoch for his son.
According to the Sumerians, kingship resumed at Kish after the flood. 23 kings ruled there until Kish was smitten with weapons. Its kingship to Unug was carried. Unug in Sumerian translates to Enoch in Hebrew. The Sumerians named in the post-flood period the city Cain built in the pre-flood period, named for his son. The Sethites, after the destruction of Eridu, relocated next door to their Canaanite cousins within a safer environment than Eridu proved to be.
The Sumerian king list uses the word Kulab, which translates loosely as twin cities. The city next door to Enoch was called Erech in Hebrew. That was part of Nimrod's kingdom in Genesis 10, 9 through 10, also known in Sumerian as Uruk.
When Stephen Langdon translated the Sumerian king list into English in 1923, he encountered the Sumerian word Unug as the second city reconstructed after the flood following Kish. Had he been faithful to the text, he would have translated it Enoch. Instead, what we read in English in Langdon's translation is Erech, the Sumerian Uruk. Why did he do that? Surely he would have been asked if this was the same city Cain built. How would you have answered that? Did Langdon believe that the city of Enoch couldn't have survived the flood? Did he wish to avoid almost certain controversy? After all, how could a respected curator of archaeology and anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania go about lending his endorsement to Bible trivia? Or perhaps he recognized that Enoch and Erech were either at the same place or they were the same place, and what difference would it make? Whatever his motives might have been will forever be unknown.
Here is Eridu on the map that we have shown in previous episodes that was smitten with weapons, but reestablished by the Sumerians as only Sumerian-style pottery is found towards the surface.
Enoch was located on the north side of the Euphrates River, along the same canal that provided water for both cities. By pooling their resources and forces, the Cainites and Sethites were able to remain secure behind fortress city walls made of mud brick. According to the Sumerian king list, the combined city of Enoch Erech was never under attack until after the flood, and by then the population had changed.
The modern city of Walker has replaced ancient Enoch, although a precinct in the city is still called Eanna, a name changed only slightly from its origin. A deep sounding was made in the Eanna precinct in 1931 through 32. The pottery was identified as Ubaid from level 18 up to level 14. It was transitioned to the Uruk or Sumerian period by level 10, a post-flood period when the Sumerians began to occupy cities that were once either Ubaidan or Akkadian. From archaeologist Leonard Woolley's analysis, the pottery from the earliest period he found at Ur that he called Al-Ubaid I was unrepresented at Waka, signifying that both Ur and Eridu had been established at earlier dates.
The great ziggurat built in Erech to honor the goddess Inanna, who was famous in that city, has slowly dissolved over the centuries into a disheveled pile of dirt and mud bricks. Today, the modern Warka stands where the children of Cain and Seth once played in dusty streets and dwelt in the walled twin cities of Enoch and Erech that grew together to become Nimrod's Erech, the Sumerian Uruk. In general, liberal theologians have not embraced the idea that Genesis in the opening chapters should be treated as historical narrative. T.L. Thompson wrote, "Not only has archaeology not proven a single event of the patriarchal traditions to be historical, it has not shown any of the traditions to be likely. Patriarchal stories are fiction that inform us about Israel's post-exilic national identity," wrote Giovanni Garbini. W.M.L. DeWitt asserted that the Old Testament was produced by authors intent on creating myth rather than recounting history. Julius Wellhausen argued that the Genesis narratives cannot be used for historical purposes at all. In his textbook on Genesis, Walter Brueggemann refers to Genesis as a process of storytelling. He introduces the early chapters merely as prehistory. In these texts, there is almost no historical particularity, he explains. Other than the reference to specific peoples in chapters 10 and 11, there is no concrete identification to historical persons, groups, movements, or institutions. Old Testament Survey is a textbook used in seminary schools today. It says, since the Pentateuch, that's the first 5 books of the Bible, is regarded as originating many centuries later than the Mosaic period, it is sometimes thought to preserve little genuine historical information, quote unquote. Unfortunately, Genesis has been assigned to a category they call prehistory or proto-history. In other words, something other than history. It was Carl Sagan who said, "The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence." Just because extra-biblical evidence was not known at the time doesn't mean none exists. Maybe they didn't think anybody would take the time to look or know where to look, or upon looking, actually find corroborating evidence that Genesis does indeed have historical integrity. We can only hope their positions will soften over time and with the circulation of the kinds of evidence such as we have produced here. Please feel free to forward these links to family and friends. Thank you, Ken, for co-hosting with me, and thank you for watching.